Good morning. It's a couple of minutes after the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and start our webinar. I wanted to welcome you to the second part of our 5-part Friday morning series on IFTDSS. Last week, we presented an overview of all the tools in the application. If you missed it, it was recorded and it's available from our website. My name is Nicole Viant. I am a fire application specialist with the Wildland Fire Management RDNA. I'm part of the government team that's helping develop the tool IFTDSS that we'll be sharing. You'll notice we're going to do a quick poll with 3 questions. If you're able to answer those, that'd be really helpful for us while I'm doing this introduction. Also, if questions arise during the presentation, please type them in the question and answer box, and we'll try and answer those during the webinar as promptly as possible, but we will also allow time at the end for more questions. So we're hoping to have the presentation take about 40 minutes, and that'll leave about 20 minutes at the end for extra questions as they arise. With that, I'd like to introduce Josh Hyde. Josh is a fire research scientist with the University of Idaho. He's been integral to the development of IFTDSS, and he is the sole person who's developed all of our help content throughout the application, which is amazing. Today, Josh will be giving you a tour of the functionality within the Map Studio. So with that, Josh.
Oh, thanks a lot, Nicole, and thank you all for attending. It looks like we have about 75% voted on the poll, so we've got a couple more. We'll take a minute for those, and then we can go ahead and jump into Map Studio. Okay, and I'm just, right now I'm on the webinars page of the IFTDSS landing page. So that's under support and webinars and trainings. And you can see the start. We have our scheduled webinars, and after Map Studio today, we have a full presentation on landscapes and editing. So I won't really go into editing as much today. We'll be looking at every other component though in Map Studio. Then modeling and reports at the end of March, and we have one more in mid-April on developing treatment alternatives. So we can get to Map Studio either through the top navigation or the prompt in the planning cycle. And how we'll start is just looking at some basic navigation to get you to your area of interest. Then we'll look at the main functions here, the widgets in Map Studio, looking at layer list, adding landscapes and modeling outputs, working with shapes and shape files, seeing some of the more commonly used widgets can help you in your task, and then wrap up with some of the less common ones that you might use more occasionally. So by the time we wrap up, you will have seen all of the widgets and tools in Map Studio. And I'm just going to start with navigating to my area of interest. And you can do this manually by left-clicking and moving the map around. I'm going to use the search box just as a demonstration. To Priest River Experimental Forest. And we can see it found that no problem. We've got our option to zoom to that area. Also on the left-hand side of the screen, there's the zoom in and zoom out. One other option is you can hold down Shift and left-click zoom to a specific map area. The next step, we have our base map gallery. So lots of choices in here. There's imagery with labels. There's also several topographic options. We have terrain with labels, our basic topographic option, US Topo, and USGS National Map. I'm going to set it to the National Geographic default. Just, it's a little bit easier to see what we have here on the landscape. And next, layer list, and this is a list of all of our active layers in Map Studio. It's basically the Map Studio equivalent to ArcMap's table of contents. You can see in the top right we have our turn all layers on and off, expand and collapse all layers. And when you first open it, it will be empty with the exception of the shapes and masks. And this layer that's turned on currently shows all of your shapes and masks within IFTDSS. And a lot of times I'll just switch this off. There's a way that we'll see using add layers that you can have a little bit more control over which shapes and shape files you add to Map Studio. And just for demonstration purposes, I will turn this back on for a minute. You can see on the right-hand side, there's the More Options button. Those three little dots there. And these are the Zoom to, the Transparency Adjustment, and Filtering. In filtering, I wanted to point out here as an alternative way that you can change which shapes are visible. If we click that, the filter box will open, and we can edit filter and choose just which shapes we want shown on the map. You can do this by folder or by name. So right now I've just got the folder that this collection of shapes is in. And we can select all or unselect and just show one or two of them. And as soon as we hit apply filter, you can see that just those two shapes that we specified is visible. And that filter tool, again, if you need it, is in the More Options, as well as this filter icon up in the top left. There's the Disable pop-up, which all that is you can click on this and it'll show a label with some metadata. If you don't want that to happen, you can disable pop-ups. I generally just leave those on. And open attribute table, which we'll see a little bit more later on. You can see if I open it now, it's got the layers in layer list across the top, and right now we just have our one, and then the two shapes that we have displayed here that are active. And the control for that attribute table is in the bottom right. So the next major thing you'll probably want to do in Map Studio is either add a landscape or create a landscape. And that's done with the Landscape Tools widget along the bottom. So if you have been using the IFTDSS system for a while, you'll probably have a collection of landscapes that can be fairly extensive. That's where the filter to map extent is handy, or just filter to the landscapes that match the extent that we have open now. The other option is to create a new landscape. It's this tab up at the top of Landscape Tools. And you can see you have the option of drawing a box on the landscape with your left mouse button, or putting in the coordinates directly. And it lists at the bottom the total area, and under that we've got versions of Landfire. Right now we've got 12 and 14 available in IFTDSS. the fire behavior fuel models, the standard 13 or 40. And then from there, we could name our landscape. And I always put the Landfire version at the end. It just kind of helps keep track of which version of landscape I have. And then I know as these accumulate, if I see a landscape that has LF 2014 or 2012 and nothing else after it, that it's a landscape that hasn't been edited or changed at all. So just kind of a handy way to keep track of things in the different drop-down menus of IFTDSS if you're looking at landscapes and don't see the folder that they're in. And that's actually the last step here, is specifying the folder. Playground is the one default folder that you get when you start an IFTDSS account, but you can create as many as you need to. So we've got our Map Studio folder here that I've created for this presentation. If we didn't have anything created, we could also create a folder using the Add Folder button. So we wouldn't have to go to My Workspace, which is the file repository, and go through that. And from there, just click Create. And depending on the size of the landscape, it could just take a minute or so. If it's a large landscape, it could take longer. Just in the interest of time, I've already created the landscape. And so if we go back to this Add Map tab that we saw at first, we can just add the landscape there. And if we use the drop-down arrow, we can see all the features in that landscape, the Landfire LCP file. We've got slope, elevation, aspect, our fuel models, which currently that's the default layer that's turned on. Then our stand and canopy characteristics. And you can see, like the shapes, there's the more options where we can zoom to or change the transparency. And we could use this landscape just as it is, and I'm going to leave it as is for now. I won't really go into editing in this webinar since we have a whole webinar set aside for it next. Aside from just to point out how that process would work, navigating from Map Studio to your editing interface and back again, because that is done in a separate box. So say, for example, there was a disturbance on this landscape that I know wasn't captured in Landfire, and maybe I want to create a mask to delineate that area and make changes to it. And this will also be a good opportunity to show how to create masks in Map Studio. And we'll go into those masks, shapes, and shape files in a little bit. But this will be the introduction for that. It's that Create and Edit Shapes widget on the bottom. And we can either draw a rectangle, again using the left mouse key. If we want to get rid of something before we save it, just the delete button. There's the polygon tool or the freehand draw tool. So let's use that for now. And we would name this whatever we want to name it for the purposes of this example. Save it to a folder and click Create. And then we get a confirmation that says our shape has been created. And it is reminding me that I still have the filter on, which is handy. So we've got our first created shape on here. And if I wanted to make edits to that, there's a few places that can be done. Probably the most direct for this example would be going into my workspace, which is the file repository for IFTDSS. Go to our Map Studio folder, and I can just find my landscape, choose the edit button, and up at the top left, split screen if we need to, and see our landscape on the map again. And then we have our editing interface that we would go through, apply edits, and save a new landscape with those edits. And then from there, we can just go back into Map Studio, go to our landscape tools again, and turn our landscape on. And you can see if we had created an edited copy, we could turn that on as well and show up in the layer list. I'll switch that off for now. This same process holds true for the modeling outputs. Those are added to the map using the Simulation Output Tools widget. And if you've created those in Modeling Playground or some other part of IFTDSS and have a bunch in here, like before, you can filter to map extent and add it to the map. And then we can drop down and see the various outputs, switch those on and off, adjust the transparency if needed. And before I go into shapes and shape files, I'll just look at a couple handy tools as far as comparing landscapes. And in this case, I've got a model output and a landscape, and maybe I want to see what the correlation is between the modeling outputs, in this case flame length, and the fuel model. A couple handy tools for that. It's the swipe tool, which is in the top right corner. And so if I click this, it starts with the first active layer we have, which is shapes and masks. Not as handy here, so I'll switch that off. So we've got our fire behavior layer is the next layer, and then the layer under that is the landscape. So I'm going to select our fire behavior layer as the one we want to hide in that bottom section. And from there we can swipe back and forth, looking at the landscape. Use the shift and zoom again so we can zoom in more, and we still retain our swipe feature. There's the identify tool also in the top right. So say in this case I want to check out this area with relatively high flame lengths. And we can see we've got a timber understory 5 is the fuel model, 31% slope. And then we've got the entire contents of that landscape layer and the modeling layer listed. So those are some handy features as you're getting familiar with your landscape, just to be able to identify different sections and swipe back and forth between the layers. You can also go ahead and switch layers on and off too using the layer list. Sorry about the background noise. So we've got shape files would be the next thing we'd be looking at here. So we saw creating a mask in IFTDSS. It's likely that you'll have your own shapefiles with your own data attached to them, since when we create a mask in here, it is just the shape and no associated data. And that is that Upload Shapefile tool, that widget at the bottom. And it's a pretty straightforward process, just kind of following the prompts of uploading a file. It'll take you to your local file directory on your computer, and you can select wherever you have your files stored. And shapefiles have to be zipped. So we'll select our shapefile. It'll think for a second while it uploads it. And we can see we have a list of the fields. So if we wanted to leave any of these out, we could uncheck them. We have a maximum of 10, so I'm just going to leave these 5 all checked. And then click Save the shapefile to my workspace. So this saves it so that we can use it at any point later in IFTDSS. If we left this unchecked, it would still add it to the map, but then as soon as we navigated away from Map Studio, it would be gone, and we'd have to re-upload it. So I'm going to check that Save Shapefile. It'll go with your default file name. You can change it if you want. I'll just leave this as default, though. And save it in the Map Studio folder that we have for this, and add to map. And pretty quick process. I'm going to turn off the swipe tool. Get rid of our upload shapefile box, and we can see it's uploaded all of the game management shapes for the state of Idaho. I can certainly do smaller areas and subsets as well. So say I have a large shapefile like this, and maybe we only want the first 3 or 4 of these, which should more than cover our area that we're working in. We can go into that more options. There's our attribute table again, and an option to create shapefile subset. So we'll click that, and it will open the shapefile for the region of the shapefile that we're looking at, and it'll be almost all of them. If we zoomed in, this table would change, and it would just show what's zoomed in on the map. And from there, we're just going to select the first 4 rows just by left-clicking, holding down the control button, and left-clicking the rows that we want. And you can see it's highlighting those, so we can see it in Map Studio as we go. And if we highlighted some other ones that we don't want, we could clear selection and restart. I'm good with these though, so we'll save selection as shapefile. And again, like when we uploaded the shapefile, it'll ask you what you want to name it and where you want to store it. So I just gave it a really quick name, saving it to the same folder, and save and add to map. And I see we've already created one name, so this is a good example. If you try to use the same name, it will warn you. So I'm just going to give it a different name there. Then we get our confirmation, and you can see it's highlighted up here. We'll go ahead and close out the attribute table. And in the first few rows I picked, it looks like there is another management area down south of where we're working. If I switch off the main shapefile, I can see there's our subset 2. Now, I had named this subset 2 because we had a previously named subset in here. And to look at that, I'm going to go to Add to Layers. And this Add to Layers is probably the easiest interface to add shapes, shape files, and also look at reference layers that are available within IFTDSS. So I'm going to turn off that subset 2 for now. Go into My Layers, find our folder, and you can see all those smaller units that we saw when we first entered into Map Studio are listed here. And instead of using the filter, if we wanted to just check a few of these, it would add each individual shape to the layer list instead of having that all-encompassing shapes and masks option. So that is a handy tool. Another use for this, like it mentioned, is the IFTDSS reference layers. And we have several options on here. There's disturbance history, infrastructure, agency boundaries. We have resources like air quality and roads, WUI and soil maps. If I zoom out for a little bit, this can also be handy if you want to copy these for use later, creating a mask with them. So say, for example, I want to create a mask that is the national forest that the research area falls in, or the planning area falls into. And that can be done pretty easily. So if you go into boundaries, highlight National Forest Service boundaries, and can see we've got the overlapping boundary, and then the rest of the national forest that this is a part of, in this case the Panhandle National Forest. Then I can go into Create and Edit Shapes and use this Copy from Existing button. And if I just wanted to copy this one shape here, I could. But for Panhandle, I know there's some other parts out here, some little islands of forested land. So I'm going to select multi-part, left click, and we can see the whole Panhandle boundary is highlighted. I'll name it and save it in Map Studio, our Map Studio folder, I mean, and it'll let us know that the shape has been created. So if I exit out of this, it was a larger shape. So I'll just go to All Layers, My Layers, and for a shape like this, we might want to refresh. There it is. So you can see we have that whole boundary area selected. So those are the main tools for landscapes, simulation outputs, shapes and shape files within IFTDSS. I've got almost all the tools. I'll just point out a couple more here. And that distinction between shapes and shape files. So right now for shape files, the functionality within Map Studio is to upload local data, which is your shapes and the data associated with them. The shapes that we create in here, either drawn by hand or copied from the reference layers, those are all just shapes. There's no data associated with them. You can use either of these as masks throughout the other parts of IFTDSS, but I just wanted to make that distinction between the two here. And I believe the only features we haven't looked at, there's the measurement feature. Just really simple, being able to look at lines and area on your landscape. And the add graphic tool. So if we wanted to do a screen capture of our map and include it in a report, we could add labels and shapes and callouts this way. So right now I've just got the text highlighted. We'll type in some text and left click. See, it adds that to the map. There's several icons that are added in that same way. And from there we could take a screen capture, and as soon as we leave that Add Geographic Tool interface, those will stay on the map even if we leave that tool interface. So you can go down and hit clear, and that will clear those out. Which makes sense, because if you're doing a screen capture, you probably don't want a lot of open dialog boxes. So that is all the features in Map Studio at the moment. Before opening up for questions, I'll just point out this webinar will be recorded, and we'll have it posted on the webinars page. We've actually got to post the previous one from last week as well, so those will both be up shortly. There's also the Help Center. In the Help Center, we can go to the main page or About This page, which in this case will take us just to the Map Studio information. And this is the main page that has the introduction to all of these widgets. You can click on one to get more information. And there's also mapping in the top menu of Help Center, which goes through topic by topic. We have the map functions that we're looking at now, information on landscapes, shapes and shape files, using your own data. There's also the forums. So there's the questions and answers forum, where you can swap messages back and forth with other IFTDSS users on things you're trying to do or having trouble working on, or just how they're using IFTDSS in their own area. And then there's the Ideas Exchange as well, that's monitored by the development team. So in this case, if you're working in Map Studio and find a feature that really would make life easier, and you wish it were in there and it's not right now, this is a great place to leave that feedback, because this is monitored pretty closely by the development team, and they certainly sift through it to see what folks are looking for and what ideas to prioritize. So with that, we've got some time to open things up to any questions.
So I'll go over, Josh, a few of the questions that were asked during the webinar, and then there's a couple I'll have you elaborate on. One of the questions was, if you pull a large landscape for, say, your forest and land fire, typically it comes down as two parts, and you have to mosaic it back together before building your landscape file to do runs. We do have a 3.5 million acre limit on our landscape, but it will generate it as a single file within IFTDSS. You don't need to do any mosaicing. And just so you know, too, landscapes that you create within IFTDSS can be downloaded for use outside, and that includes edited landscapes, but we'll go over editing a little more in a future webinar. We also had some questions about reference layers that are available within the application specific to sage grouse.
Yes.
Anything that, did you want to show those?
We do have those. Let me find them. They are, so I know sage grouse is mentioned specifically in the reference layers. And it might take me a little bit to find here. So natural and cultural resources, critical habitat, lion polygon, and sage grouse. Probably more of that in the southern part of the state. So yeah, I can see, check our layer list. So got the current occupied range, habitat management, habitat management area, areas of conservation. So this is what we currently have in for sage-grouse habitat in reference layers. And in the help, oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Josh, sorry.
I was just going to say that in the help, I believe we list what reference layers are available, and we're working on getting more information on the metadata behind each of these reference layers as well, so that will be forthcoming.
Thanks, Josh. We also had a question from someone who hasn't logged in since September and wanted to know if we had a new version, and we do. We released a new version at the end of February, and it added some enhancements. For example, Josh showed the upload and saving of shape files. We also added the ability to download the landscape as well as model output. So those are kind of the three big new things if you just this round. We also did a lot of bug fixing and other minor tweaks throughout the application. So definitely get in there and check it out if you haven't in a while. Another question was, can we elaborate on why you might want to use the masks? Do they allow you to locally change the underlying land fire data? They do. So we can use the masks in two different ways within the application. The first is to be able to limit edits when you're editing a landscape to that area within the mask. And the second is when you run reports, you can also use that area to be able to run the reports on just the masked area instead of the entire landscape. And the editing will be covered in a future webinar, and editing and reports will be covered, I believe, on the webinar following that also talks about the modeling. Next question is there a way to export an image of the map other than a simple screen capture? At this point, there isn't, but there are map images when you run reports that show each layer in your landscape as well as your model output. So it's a map image. If you have a mask on it, it'll be on the image of your elevation, aspect, slope, fuel model, etc., individual maps, as well as one that would have the fire model output, so being flame length, intensity, etc. And then there was a request for you, Josh. Can you show a split screen comparison of landscapes between the existing fuels conditions, so something pre-treatment, and a condition after, say, thinning? So do you have two you can share, Josh?
Yeah, I can do that. Let's see. I'm going to navigate back up to the area we were working in previously. Switch off some of these layers so we can get a better look at it here. So what's showing up now? We've got our landscape, our unedited landscape right now, and those fuel model layers. And I do have an example of a landscape light thin 1-year post. And this I just did for the entire landscape. You can see this is overlaying on the top. Go ahead and open up those fire behavior shoe models. And if we wanted to use the split screen on this as well, we could. So this one's kind of hard to see the changes here. There are some in that lighter thin around here. So if we do the identify tool, it'll show the TU5 for the initial landscape. And it should be showing the fuel layer for the edited landscape as well. Just in case we need to, I'm going to just going to go ahead and open a new session with just those two layers. Make things a little simpler. So I can filter by map extent. I'll turn on the priest unedited and the priest thin. Identify tool. So you can see the original TU5, and as a result of the thinning, that had changed to GS1. And then if we had done a edit with a mask, it would have just captured the changes within that unit. So did that answer your question?
Oh, we see if Andrew types back in. We had another question about running simulations with custom or local fuel model layers, and at this point you cannot. We're limited to either the 13 or 40 set of fuel models within the application, but that is a great point and maybe something we should consider. And we will cover what you can and can't do within the modeling environment in a future webinar, so you should come back.
And,
Andrew Falls saying also that, and we will talk a bit more about fuel model transitions and how edits change within the editing webinar. We'll go into a lot of detail about the options on how you can make changes and edits for different things like a thin or a prescribed fire. So there'll be a lot more detail on that in a future webinar as well.
Yeah, we really didn't touch on that hardly at all here on this one, just since it is an upcoming topic and there's so much in Map Studio. Before the next question, I want to just show you'd answered the question, Nicole, on downloading landscape files and use the same process for model outputs as well. So if you're in My Workspace, that's where you would download landscape files or model outputs to your local machine. And I would just be clicking on the file. There's a download button, and it'll come down as a zip file that would be opened as a GeoTIFF. So just figured while we had a sec, I would point that out.
So we have another question asking how greenness or seasonality is considered in these maps. Because it's using the land fire data for the fuel models, it's not typically considered. So you can change your fuel moisture within the modeling environment to indicate how cured your fuels are, so your live fuels. So that could be for your grasses or your shrub model. So you can kind of play with it that way, but it doesn't change the base fuel model. You can just change your model state conditions. So we'll give it a moment to see if there's any more questions rolling in. It's kind of slowed down a little bit, but don't be shy. Go ahead and ask.
And you mentioned there was some folks who hadn't logged in since September. I think probably the two biggest Map Studio changes they've noticed that weren't around then was that work with shape files. So being able to save a shape file to Map Studio and My Workspace by just clicking the Save checkbox. That's a relatively new feature. We used to have to save those following the same procedure that we saw when we went through and saved one of those reference layers. So saving shape files and their data has been greatly simplified, and then being able to copy a subset of shape file data as well was a new feature that was added.
Do you mind showing Josh the webinar schedule one more time, just so folks know when to tune in if they want to learn more about editing or modeling, since we've had a bit of those kind of questions?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so you can get back to the IFTDSS homepage. Just clicking on IFTDSS, and it's under User Support, Webinars, and Trainings. And we have all of our scheduled webinars. So let's start on 3/23 with the next one, Landscape Editing. There's the register button for each one of these.
But if you've registered once, just so you know, you're registered for all 5. So you'll get reminders from webinar itself to tune back in. So you don't need to re-register for them independently. And we had one more question trickle in. Can you load Landfire 2012 or 2014 data that's been updated already locally? At this point, you cannot. We do not have the ability to upload rasters into the application. So you would have to do your edits again within the system if you wanted to use that landscape. So with that, I would like to thank all of you for attending the webinar and thank Josh for doing the presentation. This will be available soon for folks who may have missed it that you think will need to tune in, or if you want to come back and refresh yourself on any of the functionality within Map Studio. And we hope to hear from you guys next week when we go over landscape editing.